In the summer of 260 CE, a Roman emperor knelt in the dust before a Persian king, not in ceremony, not in negotiation, in surrender. Valerian, ruler of the greatest empire the world had known, commander of legions that had conquered from Britain to Egypt, became the first Roman emperor ever taken alive in battle. Behind him lay the shattered remains of an army. Before him stood Shapur I, King of Kings, who had accomplished what no enemy of Rome had managed in 5 centuries. And across the Roman world, when word reached the cities and fortresses, the unthinkable became real. This was not supposed to be possible. The empire Valerian inherited in 253 CE was not the Rome of Augustus or Trajan. It was an empire bleeding from 1,000 wounds. Germanic tribes poured across the Rhine and Danube. Rival generals declared themselves emperor, splitting provinces into warring factions. The silver currency had been debased so many times, it was barely worth the metal it was struck from. Plague swept through cities, leaving streets empty and trade routes abandoned. And in the east, a new power had risen that did not fear Rome's legions. The Sassanid Persian Empire, forged by Ardashir I and expanded by his son Shapur, was not the disorganized enemy Rome had faced in earlier centuries. It was centralized, aggressive, hungry. Shapur had studied Roman tactics, trained his cavalry to match Roman discipline, built siege engines that could break Roman walls. His cataphracts, heavy cavalry encased in scale armor, had shattered legion formations across the eastern provinces. His horse archers struck and vanished like desert storms. His war elephants towered over battlefields, breaking the nerve of soldiers who had never seen such creatures. By 260, Shapur had already sacked Antioch twice, one of the greatest cities of the Eastern Empire, seat of Roman power in the east, had fallen to Persian assault. Twice. The message was clear. Rome was vulnerable. The invincible legions could be defeated. And Shapur was proving it campaign after campaign. Valerian was 60 when he became emperor. An experienced senator, a capable administrator, a man who understood the vast machinery of imperial governance. But military genius was not among his gifts. He was cautious where boldness was needed, methodical where speed mattered. Yet the eastern provinces were crumbling, and only the emperor's presence could rally what remained of Roman power in the region. In early 260, Valerian gathered an army, perhaps 70,000 men, though exact numbers are lost to history. Legionaries from across the empire, auxiliary cavalry, Syrian archers, German mercenaries. It was a powerful force on paper, enough to crush any enemy Rome had faced in the past, enough to drive Shapur back across the Euphrates and secure the eastern frontier for another generation. It would have to be enough. There was nothing left to send. Shapur I received word of Valerian's march with satisfaction. An emperor in the field meant the entire Roman army concentrated in one place. It meant prestige on the line. It meant Rome had committed everything to this campaign. And if this army failed, there would be no second chance. The Persian army that prepared to face Valerian was the product of decades of reform and training. At its core rode 10,000 cataphracts, mounted warriors encased from head to foot in scale armor, their horses likewise armored, wielding 12-foot lances that could punch through shield and man and emerge bloody on the other side. These were not raiders, they were shock troops, capable of shattering any formation they struck. Behind them came 20,000 horse archers, light cavalry armed with composite bows, trained from childhood in the Parthian shot, the technique of loosing arrows while retreating at full gallop. They could strike and vanish, appear on a ridge at dawn and be 20 miles away by noon. leaving dead Romans and empty supply wagons in their wake. Persian infantry numbered another 20,000, disciplined formations armed with spear and bow, capable of holding ground while the cavalry worked. And supporting them came the elephants, creatures from distant India, towering beasts that could scatter cavalry with their trumpeting charges and break siege lines with their massive strength. But Shapur's greatest weapon was not any unit in his army. It was patience. He understood that Rome's strength came from the steady grind of legion warfare, from siegecraft and supply lines and the methodical conquest of territory. So he refused to fight that kind of war. He would bleed the Romans, exhaust them, draw them deep into hostile territory, and let the desert do his work for him. When Valerian's army crossed into Mesopotamia in the spring of 260, Shapur smiled and gave the order. Do not engage, harass, raid, bleed them with 1,000 small cuts, and wait. Valerian's army moved through Syria like a beast too large for the land it crossed. 70,000 men consumed water and food at rates that emptied wells and stripped granaries. The supply train stretched for miles, thousands of carts carrying grain and fodder, oil and wine, weapons and armor, medical supplies and siege equipment. It moved at the pace of the slowest ox, grinding forward perhaps 10 miles a day in good conditions, less when the terrain turned difficult. The spring heat intensified as they marched east. Soldiers from Gaul and Britain, men who had spent their lives in cool forests and moderate climates, began to suffer. The sun beat down without mercy. Dust rose from 70,000 pairs of marching feet, coating everything, getting into eyes and throats and the mechanisms of armor. Men drank their water rations too quickly and collapsed from thirst before the next well. And the Persians were watching. The first attacks came at dawn on the 5th day of March. A Roman cavalry patrol, 50 men scouting the road ahead, disappeared. By noon, their bodies were found scattered across a rocky hillside, stripped of weapons and armor, arrows bristling from their backs. The Persians had struck and vanished before anyone could respond. The next day, a supply convoy, 20 wagons carrying grain, escorted by 2 centuries of infantry. The Persians appeared from a wadi at midday, 200 horse archers who circled the convoy at full gallop, loosing arrows in continuous waves. The infantry tried to form shield walls, but arrows fell like rain, finding gaps in armor, striking men in the throat and face and legs. In 10 minutes, it was over. The wagons burned. The infantry lay dead or dying, and the Persians were gone. Day after day, the pattern repeated. Foraging parties rode out and never returned. Wells the army expected to use were found poisoned or filled with stones. Villages that should have had food stores were empty. The inhabitants fled. The granaries burned. The Romans were being bled, and there was nothing Valerian could do to stop it. He tried sending out larger patrols, cohorts of 500 men with cavalry support. The Persians simply avoided them, appearing to strike smaller targets, vanishing when confronted with force. He tried night marches to cover more ground quickly. Men collapsed from exhaustion, and the Persians struck the stragglers at dawn. He tried keeping the army concentrated in tight formation. The supply situation worsened, water ran short, and the march slowed to a crawl. By the time the army reached Edessa in early June, morale had fractured. Men who had marched with confidence now looked over their shoulders constantly. Officers who had expected easy victory now understood they faced an enemy who refused to fight on Roman terms. And Valerian, watching his army weaken day by day, knew he needed to force a decision. Edessa was a fortified city in northern Mesopotamia, a Roman stronghold with high walls and deep wells. It had resisted Persian siege before. Valerian decided to make his stand there, to rest and resupply his army, to force Shapur to either attack fortified positions or withdraw. Inside those walls, the Romans would have water, food, and protection from the constant harassment. But the walls of Edessa could hold perhaps 10,000 men comfortably. The Roman army numbered 70,000. Most would have to camp outside, in the open ground before the city, exposed to whatever Shapur decided to do next. It was exactly what the Persian king had been waiting for. The Persians did not attack Edessa. They surrounded it. On the morning of June the 8th, Roman sentries on the city walls watched as the horizon filled with movement. Dust rose in great clouds. The glint of armor caught the early sun. And then they appeared. Thousands upon thousands of mounted warriors, spreading across every approach to the city, sealing every road and path like a tightening noose. The Persians did not build siege works. They did not construct towers or dig trenches or prepare for assault. They simply positioned their cavalry in a ring around the city, close enough to prevent escape, far enough to avoid Roman artillery. And they waited. Inside the Roman camp, 70,000 men looked at the enemy army and understood the trap. They were not besieged inside a fortress with thick walls and supplies. They were trapped in the open, in a sea of tents and wagons, with summer arriving and the heat intensifying and nowhere to go. The first week passed in tense stillness. The Persians made no move to attack. They sat on their horses in the distance, watching, waiting. Roman patrols that tried to break out were cut down by horse archers before they got 100 yards. Supply convoys that tried to reach the city were burned on the road. The noose was complete, and there would be no relief. Water was the first crisis. The Roman camp had been positioned near a stream, but 70,000 men and thousands of horses consumed water at an impossible rate. By the third day, the stream was running dry. Engineers dug wells frantically, but the water table was deep and the digging was slow. Rations were cut. Men began to hoard what water they had. Arguments broke out. Fights started over half-empty water skins. The heat intensified. June in northern Mesopotamia could see temperatures climb above 100 degrees. For men from northern provinces, men who had never experienced such heat, it was unbearable. Soldiers who had marched in full armor through Germanic forests, now stripped to tunics, and still felt like they were burning. The sun hammered down from a cloudless sky, turning the camp into an oven. Men collapsed in their tents. Some died from heat stroke before anyone noticed they were in trouble. By the end of the first week, discipline began to crack. Officers who tried to maintain formation drills found their men too exhausted to obey. Centuries that should have been practicing combat maneuvers sat in whatever shade they could find, conserving energy, trying to survive. Another day. The army was ceasing to function as a military force and becoming a desperate crowd of men waiting for something to change. But nothing changed. The Persians remained in position. The heat continued, and the water kept running out. On the morning of June 15th, a legionary in the 3rd cohort of the 5th Legion complained of fever and chills. By evening, he was dead. By the next morning, 15 men in his century were showing symptoms. By the 3rd day, the entire cohort was affected. The plague that struck the Roman army at Edessa may have been typhus, or dysentery, or some combination of diseases that flourished in the cramped, unsanitary conditions of a military camp under siege. The exact pathology doesn't matter. The effect was catastrophic. Disease spreads fastest in dense populations with poor sanitation and contaminated water. The Roman camp was ideal. 70,000 men packed into a space designed for 10,000. Latrines overflowing because there was no way to dig new ones without leaving the safety of the camp perimeter. Water rations so low that men couldn't wash. Food supplies running low. Weakening immune systems, and the heat, the relentless heat, making everything worse. The sick began appearing in rows. At first, the medical staff tried to isolate them, to separate the infected from the healthy. But there were too many. Hundreds became sick in the second week, then thousands. The camp followers and doctors did what they could, but without clean water, without medicine, without even basic supplies, there was little they could do but watch men die. A legionary named Marcus, a veteran of 15 years' service, woke on the morning of June 18th, feeling cold despite the heat. He tried to stand for morning formation but collapsed before he took 3 steps. His tent mates carried him to the medical area, laid him with dozens of others on the bare ground, and returned to their duties. By evening, Marcus was delirious with fever. By midnight, he was dead. His body was carried outside the camp perimeter and left with hundreds of others because there was no way to dig graves in ground this hard and no fuel to burn them. The smell of death filled the camp. It mixed with the dust and heat and the stench of overflowing latrines, creating an atmosphere of despair that sapped the will of even the strongest soldiers. Men who had faced Germanic berserkers without flinching now sat in their tents and wept, not from fear of the enemy outside, but from the horror of watching their comrades die of disease while they could do nothing to help. By the end of the 3rd week, the army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Units had lost half their strength. Officers were dead or dying. The command structure had broken down. Men who had marched east with discipline and pride now existed in a state of survival, trying to live one more day in conditions that grew worse with every sunrise. Valerian walked through the camp and saw the reality of his situation. Of 70,000 men who had marched to Edessa, perhaps 40,000 still lived. Of those, maybe 20,000 were healthy enough to fight. And they were surrounded by an enemy who had not lost a single man, who sat in comfort in the distance, who needed only to wait for the Romans to finish dying. On June 25th, a group of legionaries from the 12th Legion decided they would rather die fighting than waste away from disease. 200 men, armed with whatever weapons they still had, formed up in the pre-dawn darkness and charged the Persian lines. The Persians did not panic. They did not even move from their positions. They simply notched arrows, drew their bows, and waited. When the Romans came within range, the arrows fell, not a volley, but a continuous rain, hundreds of arrows arcing through the morning air and falling among the charging men. The legionaries tried to raise shields, tried to maintain formation, tried to close the distance, but they were weak from hunger and disease, exhausted from weeks of suffering, and they faced mounted warriors who had lost none of their strength. The arrows found gaps in armor, found faces and throats, found legs and arms and bellies. Within 5 minutes, the charge had stopped. Within 10, it was over. 200 Romans lay dead or dying on the ground. The Persians had not moved from their positions. That afternoon, another group tried. Cavalry this time, 50 horsemen who thought they could break through the Persian line and ride for help. The Persian horse archers met them with the practiced efficiency of hunters cutting down prey. The Romans never got within sword's reach. They died in the open ground between the camps, their bodies adding to the corpses that now littered the battlefield. The message was clear. There would be no escape, no relief, no rescue. The Romans would stay in their camp and die slowly, or they would try to fight and die quickly. Those were the only choices Shapur was offering. By the end of June, organized resistance had ceased. Men no longer obeyed orders because the chain of command no longer functioned. Cohorts that should have had 600 men could muster 50. Centuries were down to a dozen soldiers. Entire legions had effectively ceased to exist, their numbers reduced by disease and despair to scattered handfuls of survivors who sat in their tents and waited for death. A young legionary named Titus, barely 20 years old, sat outside his tent on the morning of July 2nd and watched his last tent mate die of fever. Titus had joined the legion 3 years earlier, eager to serve Rome, eager to see the world beyond his small village in Italy. He had imagined glory and conquest. He had never imagined this. Sitting in filth, surrounded by corpses, too weak from hunger to stand, watching the sun rise on another day of suffering, while an enemy he had never fought waited patiently for him to die. Titus tried to remember why he had joined, tried to remember the pride he had felt putting on his armor for the first time, tried to remember believing that Rome was invincible, that the legions could not be defeated, that the empire would last forever. All of it felt like a dream from another life. The only reality was the heat and the smell, and the knowledge that tomorrow would be worse than today, and he would probably not live to see the day after. He was right. Titus died that afternoon. Another body added to the thousands that now surrounded the Roman camp. Testament to the worst military disaster in Rome's history. On July the 3rd, Persian envoys rode into the Roman camp under a flag of truce. They carried a message from Shapur I. The time for negotiation had passed. The time for mercy was over. The Romans had one choice remaining: surrender now, unconditionally, or the Persians would attack, and no quarter would be given. Valerian called together his surviving officers. Perhaps 20 men answered the summons, all that remained of the command staff of an army that had numbered 70,000. They gathered in the emperor's tent, men who could barely stand, who had watched their legions die day by day, who knew they had no options left. Some argued for one last attack, a final charge that would at least let them die as soldiers instead of prisoners. Others argued for attempting a night breakout, a desperate rush that might let some men escape even if most died. But Valerian looked at the faces of his officers and saw the truth. They were defeated, not by Persian arms, but by disease and heat and time. The army that had marched to Edessa no longer existed. On the morning of July 5th, Valerian rode out to meet Shapur. He took with him a dozen officers, the last of his staff, men who could barely sit their horses. They wore their finest armor, polished as best they could with hands that shook from weakness. They wore their imperial regalia, the symbols of Rome's power, trying to maintain dignity even in defeat. The meeting took place in the open ground between the camps. Shapur I sat on his horse, surrounded by his nobles, all of them fresh and strong, their armor gleaming, their bearing confident. They watched the Romans approach like hunters, watching wounded animals. Valerian began to speak, to propose terms, to suggest ransoms and exchanges. Shapur listened in silence. When the Roman emperor finished, the Persian king gave his response. There would be no terms, no negotiations, no exchanges. The Romans had one choice: surrender completely, lay down all weapons, accept whatever fate Shapur decided for them, or return to their camp and die there. Valerian looked at the Persian king and understood he had no leverage, no bargaining position, no way to negotiate. He was defeated, and everyone knew it. The Emperor of Rome, ruler of the greatest empire the world had known, had been reduced to begging for mercy from an enemy who had never lost control of the situation. When Valerian tried to turn his horse back toward the Roman camp, Persian guards moved to block his path. The emperor was not a negotiator. He was a prisoner, and he would never return to Rome. The Roman officers with Valerian tried to resist. Swords were drawn. There was a brief, futile struggle. Some officers were cut down, others were disarmed and bound. And then Shapur rode toward the Roman camp with Valerian in chains at his side. For the soldiers who remained alive in that camp, seeing their emperor led as a prisoner broke the last fragment of resistance. Unit by unit, the survivors laid down their weapons. Some wept. Some stood in numb silence. All understood they were witnessing the unthinkable. A Roman emperor captured. Rome defeated. The world they knew ending before their eyes. The Persian army moved through the Roman camp, collecting prisoners, gathering weapons, sorting the valuable from the worthless. Officers and nobles were chained and marched east to Persia. Common soldiers were stripped of armor and released, left to find their way back to Roman territory if they could. Valerian himself was taken to Persia in triumph. Shapur paraded him through Persian cities, displaying the emperor like a trophy. Later accounts claim Shapur used Valerian as a footstool when mounting his horse, forcing the emperor to kneel while the king stepped on his back. When Valerian finally died in captivity, Persian sources say his body was flayed, the skin preserved and displayed in a Persian temple as a permanent monument to Rome's humiliation. Of 70,000 men who had marched to Edessa, perhaps 30,000 survived to struggle back to Roman territory. The rest died of disease, combat, or captivity. The disaster shattered Rome's eastern defenses and proved that even emperors could be defeated, captured, broken. The psychological impact was profound. Rome's aura of invincibility was gone. The crisis of the 3rd century deepened, and the world learned that even the greatest empire could bleed. On a rock face in southern Iran, Shapur's relief still stands today, carved into living stone, showing a Roman emperor on his knees before the King of Kings. The image endures, a permanent reminder that power is temporary, that no empire lasts forever, and that hubris, when faced with patience and preparation, leads even emperors to kneel in the dust far from home.